I'm Michael Krasny, and I'm pleased to welcome you to another weekly episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny podcast. If you have not yet become a member of this deep dive interview and interactive podcast, which covers an extraordinary range of intellectually stimulating topics and features leading national and global figures, experts, and opinion shapers, we urge you to sign up and become a member simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. In this episode, we wanted to discuss the ongoing crisis of the war between Israel and Hamas, and we are fortunate to have Daniel Sokatch with us for this episode, who, since 2009, has been the CEO of the New Israel Fund, an organization dedicated to organizations driving positive social change and furthering justice and equality in Israel. Selected by the Jewish newspaper The Forward as one of the 50 leading Jewish decision makers and opinion shapers, he formerly served as head of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco. He's a graduate of Brandeis with a master's degree from Tufts and a law degree from Boston College, and he is the author of Can We Talk About Israel? A Guide for the Curious, Confused, and Conflicted. And I welcome Daniel Sokatch to this episode of Gray Matter. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Michael. It's good to be here.
I guess the place to begin is just by mentioning that I saw an interview you did with Daniel Handler, a.k.a. Lemony Snicket, who is a San Francisco Bay Area children's writer of some note. I saw it and didn't realize his hair had turned gray since I had seen him the time before that. But you were talking very seriously about your book, and your book had just come out, and he was talking about how you were described, as one of the reviewers of the book said, as irritatingly even-handed. Now, this is something you could wear as a badge, especially since you are head of what is seen as a Zionist organization. We can talk about that. But certainly a pro-Israel organization. But a pro-Israel organization has worked on behalf of Palestinian citizens and Arab citizens and gone to great lengths to be even-handed. So let's begin by talking about how even-handed can one be now in wake of the October 7th attack and in wake of the fact that there's war now between Hamas and Israel.
Well, I suppose, well, first of all, I do wear it as a badge of honor. It was a British podcaster who called me irritatingly even-handed. Incidentally, my other favorite critique of the book, or I guess me, came from a otherwise very positive review in the New York Times Sunday Book Review. But the reviewer concluded that at the end of the day, the author didn't provide a solution to the Middle East crisis, only reasons for hope. And I felt guilty as charged. Look, I think that when I think about what it means to try to be even-handed, it means not so much trying to be even-handed about every event that happens in what has been essentially a more than century-long conflict between Palestinians and Jews in that small strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, but rather to be even-handed on a more at the 40,000-foot level. Right, to be able to say these are two people, both of whom have absolutely legitimate connections and ties to this place, who have endured genuine histories of suffering, who are, in the words of the Israeli historian Benny Morris, righteous victims, both of the world, also of each other, and in fact, often of themselves. But that they both deserve the basic human dignity, human rights, self-determination that all individuals and all peoples deserve. So that's really what I take as a badge of being even-handed, really respecting and holding with compassion two connections, two stories about this place that are, in my opinion, equally legitimate.
And the Semitic brotherhood almost that should fashion the way these people interact. I'm talking about Jews and Palestinians, but has been so against them because the world has been against them. And, you know, what happened in the Holocaust and then what happened as a totally opposite narrative as the Nakba are completely at odds with one another. And that's where you get into the problems of the irreconcilability of the narratives that just don't stand up against are totally against each other.
Yeah, although flashes of understanding and compassion happen in the strangest of places, right? The founding father of Israel, the George Washington of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, said once, I'll paraphrase, he said, yes, there was thousands of years of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, but what is that to them? He said, referring to the Palestinians. All they know is that we've come and stolen their country. and for the the incredibly effective, sometimes necessarily brutal, in the pursuit of the goal of political Zionism, to create a refuge for the Jewish people in the land of Israel, that Ben-Gurion of all people at least had the insight to understand and be honest with himself about what the salvation of the Jewish people meant for the Palestinians, and what it meant for the Palestinians was their dispossession from a place where they had lived in for centuries. That flash of honesty is something that's been all too rare in this conflict on both sides.
Well, as late as 1967, Ben-Gurion was talking about giving land back, and Gaza was essentially an attempt, among many others, to try to do that. And one could argue from the Israeli standpoint, particularly from the more reactionary standpoint, that, I mean, how are you going to have a two-state solution when Gaza could have been a resort area, it could have been a place of amity toward Israel and gotten along with Israel, but just the opposite, building tunnels of about 450 miles and all the rest of that has been constantly a source of, well, what is now warfare, but even has been belligerent and antithetical even long before this.
Right, not just warfare, terrorism.
And terrorism, of course.
Monstrous attacks on civilians, of course. Yes, that is a totally understandable position for those Israelis and supporters of Israel who take the position. However, I think that we have to challenge ourselves to think of the Palestinian position, right? And for them, these are people who as they see it, have been reduced to a tiny rump of what was their homeland. And for them to say, look, where's the fairness? Where's the equity and the equality and the justice in us being told we should be satisfied with a 4 to 5 mile wide, 25-mile strip of what was once historic Palestine? It's also understandable why they would feel that is an impossible situation. And how can we, and look, and if, we can look and see that something, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, something on the magnitude of 24,000 Palestinians, the overwhelming majority of them civilians, have been killed in Israel's bombing in response to the monstrous attacks of October 7th. So what we can imagine how Israelis would say, how can we live in peace next to these, to this entity? But we can also imagine how Gazans would say, how can we live in peace next to that entity? So, again, part of being irritatingly even-handed is trying to be honest and recognize that history didn't begin on October 7th, and it didn't begin in June 67, and it didn't begin in May 1948, and it didn't even begin in the 1880s when the political Zionist movement really came to the fore in Eastern Europe. But rather, we have to go back to really appreciate and understand the genuine connections that the Jewish people have to this place. It is a real and genuine historical connection, but we have to also recognize the real and historical Palestinian connection.
That's also, as the Christian Zionists tell us, a very strong biblical connection that the Jewish people have to the land of Israel. But this sometimes seems to be such a polarized argument that there's no middle ground, or one seeks for middle ground. And now things are shifting. Here in the United States, there's still backing of Israel. And in fact, just reading an article in Foreign Affairs about, remember, axis of evil under George Bush? They were talking about an axis now of Palestinians and, that is Hamas Palestinians, and also Iran and all of Iran's surrogates, and working in some way together as a resistance against the United States and Israel. So we see things unfolding in ways that are very disturbing, and with this war that's only been exacerbated. My question for you, though, is the generation is changing. Older people in the United States, including all those Christian evangelicals, are very pro-Israel. You get into a younger generation, and now increasingly you see young people, so-called woke people, I don't know what you want to call or characterize them as, being anti-Israel and identifying with the Palestinians. What would you say to a young person who has heard this argument that Israel is a colonial power? It's part of, Western hegemony. It's colonial, not only colonial, but it's also keeping oppressed people occupied. And I don't mean occupied in terms of keeping them their minds occupied. I mean occupying their land, and staying in their land is occupation. That they're colonial. And also there's genocide and apartheid. Those words have been thrown out. I know there's a lot to throw at you, but I think this is what young people are hearing and why they're going out and protesting in favor of Hamas or Palestinians.
Well, let's try to approach that big, tough set of questions. I'll try to pull them apart as best I can, and you'll utz me to return to anything that I've missed here. But look, first of all, I think we should acknowledge that in this country, for a very long time, the narrative put forward by Israel and much of the American Jewish community and the Christian Zionist community, and frankly, the political classes in this country, both parties, has very much reflected the Israeli narrative, the Israeli story. And there is great truth to that story and legitimacy to that story. But it also includes myths and things that are perhaps not necessarily historically accurate, or rather are not totally accurate. I often say that the story of Israel and the Palestinians reminds me of the parable of the blind men who stumble across an elephant in the jungle, and each one feels a part of the elephant and assumes that he understands what an elephant is. Right? An elephant is a leg-like, a tree trunk-like leg, or an elephant is a sinuous trunk, or an elephant is a floppy ear. And of course, what they can't see is they each are encountering a part of the elephant, but it's not the whole story. And I think that this conflict is often like that elephant for so many of us. What we know, because we've received it from our parents, our clergy, the news we choose to read, the media we absorb, the trip we may have taken, it is a trunk or a leg or a tail, but it's not the whole elephant. And so the dominant part of the elephant that has really guided the discourse in this country since Israel's inception has been the Israeli one, for all kinds of good and understandable reasons. But that now is being challenged. One might say that in Europe, it has been freighted the other way for a long time. And the Palestinian narrative has held more sway in the discourse over Israel and the Palestinians. Now we are seeing that the hegemony of that narrative challenged by the Palestinian story. And again, to return to the irritatingly even-handed position, both of these stories are legitimate. They also both contain illegitimate myths but as a way of understanding the conflict, it's like many things we've experienced in this country. Over the last few years, we're seeing the rise of new ways of understanding old paradigms, and so. For example, with gender pronouns, there is now a movement to rethink that. And that is frightening and irritating for some people, and perhaps for good reason, perhaps not. But it is the reality. We have to accept that is now part of the narrative. And there are truths in that narrative. And without drawing too much of an analogy, right, that is happening now too with young people. So I think the first thing we have to understand is that not everyone who is critical of Israel is wrong. Like our own country, Israel has done things that it's perfectly reasonable to criticize. When it comes to some of the more inflammatory, or I would argue non-factual pieces that are part of this new narrative, I think it's incumbent upon us to identify them and argue and present a case. However, if we're not willing to do the same thing when it comes to the myths that also surround the factual narrative when it comes to the Israeli and Jewish narrative, then we're at a real disadvantage. So. You mentioned the charge that Israel is a sort of settler colonial state. Now, there are a lot of smart people who are thinking and writing about this now. But one way to understand this is in the words of the editor and publisher of Haaretz newspaper, Israel's leading liberal daily, who I once heard say to one of his staff people, Of course, Israel is a colonial enterprise, but it's not a settler colonial enterprise. It's not a project of the West or of America or Britain intended to exploit the resources and conquer territory. It was a desperate move by a people who were on the brink of extermination, who had nowhere else to go. Or in the words of the great late Israeli author and peace activist Amos Oz, the justification for Zionism, for the establishment of Israel, is like the justification that a drowning person has when she swims to a plank that's floating in the sea. She has every right to cling to that plank, even if there's already someone clinging to the plank, even if she needs to shove the first person over a little bit to make room for herself. but she doesn't have the right to shove that first person into the sea. And so, to my mind, no one's ever put it more elegantly. So, I think there's a pretty powerful argument that the settler enterprise in the West Bank in the post-1967 scenario resembles more of historical settler colonialism. But that would be a misinterpretation and a misunderstanding of the return of Jews to Israel, who had no other place to go and no other choice, just as it would be a mistake to pretend, as the early Zionist slogan pretended, actually formulated by a Christian Zionist, that the return of the Jews to Israel was the return of a people without a land to a land without a people. That's a myth. But so too is it a myth that Jews were sent to Israel as part of some nefarious colonial enterprise.
Well, it was actually Britain who colonized that part of the world and decided with the United Nations to turn things over to the Jews, so to speak, and let them have a land of their own, let them have Zion to build a nation. On the other hand, the nation that was turned over to them, that was built, was, many argue, on the heels of a Palestinian nation, which there's no word of in that United Nations, what set up the state of Israel. Palestine didn't have a state, and yet the Palestinian people obviously have a very strong identity in spite of that.
In fact, the United Nations, after the British terminated their mandate after World War II, when they handed things over to the fledgling United Nations, they handed over, as you say, a territory, a mandate in historic Palestine.
It's the Balfour Declaration, basically.
That's right. Years after the Balfour Declaration, the United Nations actually proposed partitioning. In fact, it ruled that the land was to be partitioned into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. Neither side was totally satisfied with this. The Jews, because they wanted a bigger and more secure state. The Palestinians, for the reasons we discussed earlier, because they felt like, why are you asking us to accept a tiny fraction of what our homeland was? But it was true that the leadership of the fledgling Israeli state, we call it the Yishuv in the pre-state era, accepted the UN partition, and the Palestinian leadership did not accept it. And that is also factual. The reasons for that are complicated, but the UN did try to create two states, one Jewish, one Palestinian, and it wasn't successful because Palestinians rejected that offer.
Well, and Dennis Ross, who is very even-handed or has been called even-handed many times, has pointed out that Arafat refused to take essentially what was a compromise and take land and so forth. I mean, we have that periodically throughout history. And I have to talk to you about leadership, and I want to in a moment, but you're mentioning Amos Oz, who's someone I had a great deal of respect for and had the privilege of interviewing, who showed, I think, a great deal of moral courage. The metaphor that he uses about the plank brings to my mind another metaphor which seems somehow more fitting in some people's minds, despite the genius of Amos Oz. And that is the scorpion and the frog trying to get across the Jordan River. And Scorpion says, I'll help you get across the Jordan River. And says, no, you'll sting me. You're a scorpion. And Scorpion says, why should I do that? If I sting you, I die. And we can work together. That's much better. You know the story, I'm sure, Daniel. They decide to go across or halfway across, and the scorpion stings the frog, and the frog is dying, and the scorpion is dying, and the frog says, why? He says, because this is the Middle East. And in some ways, that resonates, especially with what we're seeing now, with all these people being killed in Gaza, of children, women, so much death and destruction, the terrible horror that went and occurred to Israelis on October 7th. And I'm also thinking about Fauda, which a lot of people have seen, and there's just Israelis and Palestinians killing each other and just continuing to kill each other over and over again. It's so disheartening and so demoralizing, and I don't want to put things in that perspective, but you've always had a more hopeful view. You've almost epitomized that hopeful view. Why?
It's a really good question these days. And when you were talking about the scorpion and the frog parable, I thought, who's the scorpion? Who's the frog? Right?
Yeah, exactly. I've heard that in response to it in many instances. Right.
Right. Look, what we just discussed, sort of the initial attempt at partition, or at least the initial United Nations attempt at partition, which one side accepted and the other side rejected. If we fast forward decades to the 21st century, Twice the Arab League put forward a proposal that would have envisioned full Israeli recognition of Israel by the entire Arab League, full integration of Israel into the region, not just one or two or three countries, as is now the case, in exchange for a Palestinian state on something that looked like the 67 borders, and Israel didn't accept that. So when you told that parable, I thought, boy, both sides have failed to take advantage of the opportunities to make peace that have been provided to them. But I suppose my optimism comes from my deep well of Jewish fatalism. There's a term that used to be associated with the Israeli army in earlier years, ein brera. We have no choice. We have no choice but to pursue the position that we've pursued in being strong and defending Israel. But I feel that this notion of no choice, of ein brera, takes on a new meaning today. Before we went on air, I heard on National Public Radio a State Department spokesperson say that the position of the United States of America and of much of the world is that there is no other option than a return to a real search for a two-state solution. There is no other way out of this nightmare, this monstrous cycle of violence that has consumed so many innocent lives on both sides for so long, as you just said. There is no other way out. The two sides may wish to try to wish the other away, but no one's going anywhere.
And forgive me, Daniel, but
Yeah.
you've got the backing of a two-state solution. You've got the United Nations. You've got the United States. You've got the Palestinian Authority. You've got so many who are behind that. And yet you have the leader of Israel saying no now on a two-state solution. So that's why I wanted to ask you about leadership. You got Bibi Netanyahu, who is essentially seen by many in Israel now as being responsible for the lack of intelligence and security that caused the whole catastrophe, and I'll use that word advisedly because it's the Nakba word, that occurred on October 7th to happen against Israel. Here's Bibi Netanyahu leading the charge. A New Yorker, the most recent issue, David Remnick had an article, a very well-done article about all this, and he said, essentially, Gaza's burning and Netanyahu is staying in power. And this leaves many Israelis, especially Israelis who see it the way you do, disconsolate.
Well, I suppose there's an interesting place for seeds of hope, and I keep coming back to your question of how does one retain hope, and for me personally, it's a long-term thing. The cliche of a marathon, not a sprint, is how I think about this, and I think that there is no other plausible good alternative that is even remotely likely, in my opinion. No matter how many utopian ideas there are about two peoples living together in one country democratically, that's a lovely notion. And as Americans, it appeals to us. And yet neither of the parties in any serious way wants that. So the way forward seems to be what Yitzhak Rabin described as the divorce, right? Separation between the sides, at least for some period of time. But you're absolutely right that a major obstacle to a resumption of that process, which, again, as you said, the rest of the world, the rest of the sane, civilized world now sees that as, once again, the only option, however difficult it is to get there. And folks like former Ambassador Dan Kurtzer and Aaron David Miller, a chief negotiator, both of whom I should say in full disclosure, either are on or have served on the New Israel Fund board, and people like former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, the Arab League of Israel, the Arab League, the Biden administration, as you pointed out, they all say this is the only way forward, and we need to take, if you will, advantage of the horrific catastrophe that is engulfing the region to try to move towards this only way out. And yet you've got a leader in Israel who absolutely refuses, and has always refused, or has long refused, I should say. But here is another seed of hope, because recent polls suggest that anywhere from 80 to 85% of the population of the state of Israel wants Netanyahu gone, out of office. And there are a lot of reasons for this. It's not because they all support a two-state solution. It largely has to do with two factors, one of which you mentioned, which is Israelis ascribe responsibility for the disastrous state of unpreparedness that Israel found itself on October 7th. Quite correctly, they ascribe it to their political leadership. That's who has to be responsible for these things. We know that in 1973, 50 years before, almost to the day, before the October 7th attack. The Yom Kippur War broke out when Egypt crossed over the Suez Canal and threw the Israelis back in the Sinai Peninsula. It was a devastating war. It ultimately brought down the Golda Meir Moshe Dayan government. It ended the rule of the Labor Party in Israel for so far for forever, pretty much. And it also resulted in the peace process that led to Egyptian-Israeli peace. Now, there has been no sign that Netanyahu is going to take any responsibility. In fact, he has denied responsibility. Some of his fellow ministers, the heads of the army and the intelligence services, have all said we're responsible, but not Benjamin Netanyahu. And so I think that on the one hand, what everybody else in the world, including many Israelis like Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, see as the only way forward now is not going to happen when Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister of Israel, in no small part because he's reliant on ultra right wingers to stay in party who are radically opposed to any concessions to Palestinians and who are in fact people I would describe as Jewish supremacists, kind of like a parallel to white supremacists here.
People who also want to keep the settlements going and want to take the territory back and so forth. We got questions coming in. I want to go to some of them.
Sure.
But there's lots more, obviously, for us to talk about, especially when you mentioned Netanyahu, who I think has similar ambitions that our former President Donald Trump has to stay out of jail and to stay out of prison, which may have something to do with his continuing occupying his position of power. But let's go to some of our listeners. Sam is in St. Louis, and he says, has there been a time, and thanks for the question, Sam, over the last 3,000 years that Palestine was truly independent?
Well, it's an interesting question, and there have been periods when there was. I mean, we're going back into antiquity and into sort of biblical and Roman era times when there was a Jewish kingdom that sort of famously or infamously lasted about 75 years, which is about how long the state of Israel has existed now, a parallel that has not been missed by many worried Jews in the world. And it resulted ultimately in a Roman invasion and the collapse of Jewish sovereignty and the beginning of what we call the diaspora, right? The scattering of the Jewish people to the four corners of the world. That's the last time there was any kind of independent rule by Jews or anybody else in that land. After that, the territory passed from great empire to great empire. Finally, the Ottoman Empire, which is, as we sort of noted earlier, after World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire resulted in the British retaining a mandate and then handing that over to the United Nations and then Israel. So that's the answer to the question is you have to go back 2,000 years to see any kind of independent rule by anybody in that land.
And here's Reed who says, thank you for your work. I find it difficult to reconcile the image of Jews as perpetrators of genocide given our history. Friends in Israel seem to be in denial of the extreme hardship being visited upon Gaza. Help me understand, please.
Well, first of all, it is my opinion, and I guess we're going to see how the International Court of Justice responds to this, that Israel, from the evidence that we've seen, from what I've heard from the South African case, the South Africa has brought a case to the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of either perpetrating or intending to perpetrate genocide in Gaza. Israel usually ignores these proceedings when these kinds of things happen. It has not ignored this one, a measure of its concern about this particular case. And we've now learned that Germany will present in this case, arguing that Israel's not committing genocide. It does not seem to me that there's a serious argument that Israel is currently committing genocide as it is defined in international law right now, where you need to have both the intent and the ability, and then the actual operationalization of that ability in carrying out genocide. One could argue that Hamas had genocidal intent when it stormed into Israeli communities on October 7th, but not the ability to carry out an actual genocide. I think sometimes the argument over genocide tends to obscure the horror of what's actually happening. And I'm not a military expert, and I don't purport to be one, but I think that there are extremely plausible arguments to be made, or hypotheses that people are forming now that clearly Hamas and also Israel are in violation of international human rights law and the rules of war as put forward in the Fourth Geneva Convention in this current conflict. You don't have to be committing genocide to be violating international law. In other words, in terms of the spirit of the question that was asked, look, I think it's very difficult for any of us to see people who have been brutalized acting in a brutal manner in return, but that's the nature of human relations and of whether we're talking about people or countries. And I think that one of the mistakes that we've made is assuming that that countries always have the ability to adhere to a moral standard, right? That we ourselves would want to adhere to, or to put another way, countries act like countries, and sometimes they're more enlightened than at other points in their history. Sometimes they're less so. So, and the second thing I would say is that I don't think anyone should make the terrible mistake of attributing to Jews and the Jewish people responsibility for the actions of Israel, whatever they may be, any more than it would be fair to attribute to Arab citizens of the United States or Palestinian Americans responsibility for what Hamas did on October 7th or what bin Laden did on September 11th. That is a terrible canard, and it reeks of bigotry and prejudice. And so those folks who now are attacking American Jews or criticizing American Jews or world Jews around the world, or for that matter, all Israelis, and holding them responsible for the actions of what the current Israeli government is doing, that's an unconscionable and immoral position, just as it would be to hold Palestinian Americans responsible for what Hamas is doing, or to hold all Gazans responsible for what Hamas is doing. So I think we should reject that on all sides.
And one should add, there are many Jews, I mean, a significant number, who are anti-Zionists, who believe that they're part of a diaspora still. There's been that argument that's very much current now, but also who are Haredi and think that the Messiah hasn't come, so Israel is not the Messianic state. And one can add to that list a number of groups. I'm thinking also of Jewish Voice of Peace and groups like that are frankly anti-Israel.
Or people like me who absolutely object to the policies of the current Israeli government, but who don't consider themselves at all anti-Israel. To hold any group, if you're holding Jew, there's a word for when you hold Jews responsible for what Israel does, whether you like it or you don't like it, and that word is anti-Semitism. Right? That is a classic example of anti-Semitism.
I think you've said that anti-Semitism is not anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism unless it is anti-Semitic or unless it is racist, which is an interesting qualification. Here's Philip, who says the Palestinians act as shields for Hamas and that the Israelis killed on October 7th were legitimate targets. Do the Palestinians recognize civilians as separate from enemy combatants?
Well, not to get too entangled in the rules of war and international law, but the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to its signatories, which are by definition nation states. Israel is a signatory to the Fourth Geneva Convention, so it is held to a standard of behavior that a terrorist organization like Hamas, which can't be party to an international convention and wouldn't be party to an international convention, is not held. And so this is a difficult pill for us to swallow sometimes. I'm often told, well, why is Israel being criticized? Look what we did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the bombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden. That is to say, countries with a just cause, who had a just cause to wage war, did terrible things. Why is Israel, which certainly after October 7th, had just cause, why are they being singled out? And my response is, after World War II, the Fourth Geneva Convention and the United Nations and the international legal system, which the United States has been the single most significant pillar of, responsible for all, despite all of the conflicts and terrors of the last 80 years or so since World War II, those things have been fragile often, but necessary shields against the kind of monstrosities that happened during World War II, even the things that were carried out by the democratic countries who were legitimately fighting just war. Or to put it another way, The reason why the Fort Geneva Convention exists now and why we, the United States and the Europeans and the victors, set up these structures is so that there wouldn't be another Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The fact that you have the right to wage war, to defend your people, to obviate a threat, doesn't mean under these rules of war that you have the right to do everything and anything in order to achieve that ends. And countries like Israel and the United States and the UK, the countries that many of us think of as sort of the good guys in the world, they have obligations. There are things that they may not do. So when President Biden describes the bombing of Gaza as indiscriminate, he's sending a signal, right? He's letting the Israelis know that your closest ally and best friend sees the nature of your response as moving towards something that is disproportionate to the just war cause that you have in pursuing it. So again, a kind of wonky answer, but democratic countries don't have the right to act in a way that is contrary to international law. They are in fact required to uphold that law.
And the argument is that's a double standard. I'm sure you've heard that argument, a countervailing argument. Right?
Sure, but I don't think that many of us would want
a double
United
standard
States,
where war is concerned, obviously.
Yeah, sure, but I think that, these laws and ideas are really easy in the abstract to agree to. It's when there's a war that they are tested. And, my argument is always, do you want the United States and the nations of, Western Europe and for that matter, Israel, do you want them to act like Iran and Syria? Do you want them to act like Putin's Russia? Because most of us think, no, that's a terrible idea. And in a country like Israel, which, as you and I have alluded to, prior to October 7th, was in the midst of another crisis, a crisis of democracy, an assault by the government of Israel on its own democratic institutions, in particular the High Court of Justice, something that resonates with great concern to many Americans looking at 2024, right? There are thankfully a vast majority of Israelis who say, look, however challenging, however flawed we may be, we want to remain a part of the camp of democratic nations. We don't want to go where Netanyahu is leading us. And so, yes, of course, countries like Syria and Iran and terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and Hamas act in ways that are contrary to international law and the rules of war. But I don't think that's anything that any of us ought to look at as aspirational.
So we put ourselves in democratic countries to a higher standard, and that higher standard means not necessarily taking collateral damage of civilian lives the way is being done now in Gaza.
Right. I mean, Nick Kristof wrote a good column last week where in the New York Times where he said, look, here are some questions I get from my friends who think I'm being too critical of Israel and too critical of the Palestinians. And one of the ones that he cited was, essentially resembled the question that the questioner asked, what is Israel supposed to do when it's fighting a terror organization that has absolutely no scruples about embedding itself in a civilian population and using its own civilian population as human shields, which, let's be clear, Hamas absolutely, that's exactly what they do. They have absolutely no concern for the lives of Gazans. They knew what was going to happen if they perpetrated the abominations that they perpetrated on Israelis on October 7th. They knew Israel would respond with crushing force. You don't have to be a political genius or even cynical to understand that is in large part what they intended. They wanted to drag Israel into the trap. The blueprint was written in Algeria in the 1950s, right? They wanted to drag Israel into a massive overreaction that would extinguish the sympathy that the world had for Israel in the wake of the horror of October 7th and replace it with fury and anger. And so far, they seem to have
succeeded.
That plan seems to have gone off pretty well.
Yeah, they've succeeded in just what you've described in that way. They also have managed to keep the United States from influencing to the degree that it had some kind of brokered amity between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think that was also a big reason. And another big reason that they acted when they did was they saw that security was breaking down. They even had plans that now have been made evident to us that Israel had possession of, and they were able to invade in a way that perhaps with this constitutional crisis that you mentioned, they couldn't have before. So things were kind of moving toward a perfect place for them. And yet at this point, is Israel overreacting?
Well, I mean, look, again, like I said, I'm not a military expert, but it seems to me that there is a powerful argument that Israel has overreacted. And on a personal level, it seems to me that they have. Again, back to the Kristof article, when people say, well, what is Israel supposed to do? As Kristof writes, the Biden administration has been telling Israel what it thinks it should do, a more focused, a more strategic attack on the leaders of Hamas. Yes, it's difficult and dangerous and challenging, but again, countries that want to be part of the civilized world have to act in a different manner than countries that think nothing of flattening, what Tom Friedman wrote in his book From Beirut to Jerusalem, the Hama rules, right? What the Assad regime did to a Syrian city where they just destroyed it, flattened it, and killed everybody. What, the Chinese government or the Russians do now. I mean, this is the danger for Israel, right? Israel has dropped bombs that are bigger than the bombs that we dropped, right, during the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so when you have U.S. military people saying, and the U.S. president, who has been the best friend Israel has ever had, that this is an overreaction, I think that they are probably correct.
Now, there's been a lot of tension recently to supposed talks going on. I'm not talking about talks for peace. I hope those are going on as well, but talks going on to try to move Palestinians to Congo, of all places. I mean, even Tony Blair supposedly was involved in this. Do you have any intelligence on this or way of saying, because we're talking about maybe what some see as ethnic cleansing, although it takes us back historically in the United States to President Abraham Lincoln trying to move slaves to Liberia. And that's actually a historical fact as well.
Well, I would argue that what is being discussed, and we've heard various things, and recently, after enormous American pressure, Prime Minister Netanyahu finally said, no, that is not what we are going to do. I happen to have written an op-ed in the Forward newspaper about this very issue the week before. I'm under no illusions that the Prime Minister read my op-ed and decided to change course. But what I argued was that that the idea to encourage what they call voluntary emigration, which really began with some of those ministers we discussed earlier, those ultra right-wing ministers in the Israeli government, is in fact, I mean, there's an absurdity to suggesting that people are voluntarily leaving a tiny territory that your country is bombing relentlessly. That's hardly voluntary departure. But, these ministers have been absolutely forthright in saying we should kick them out. A minister in the Israeli government said, what we're talking about is Nakba 2023, the expulsion and flight of Palestinians in 48. So there are, I think, very reasonable and credible reasons for people to be concerned that there are some people in Israeli authority who are contemplating that very thing. I think that the U.S. has made it very clear that that's unacceptable, right? There are these sort of principles that the U.S. has put forward, and one of them is Gaza will remain Palestinian and no one will be forced to leave Gaza. But yeah, there are people in Israel who were looking to do this. I think thankfully there has been a bright light shined on what is in my opinion would be a version of ethnic cleansing. And you're correct. There are many examples of this throughout history. In fact, Israel was formed, in the cauldron of the worst examples of ethnic cleansing in recorded human history, where millions of Hindus and Muslims were forced over borders into what is now Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, right? In Cyprus and in the islands in the Mediterranean, Greeks and Turks were forced out of territory and forced into other territory. And of course...
And millions of Jews were forced out of Arab lands.
Well, exactly. And I was going to say, in the corner of the world that we're talking about, during Israel's War of Independence, which Palestinians refer to, as you've said, as the Nakba, their catastrophe of dispossession, somewhere in the neighborhood of 700,000 Palestinians either fled or were forced out of what is now Israel. And for those of our listeners who don't believe what I just said, I would refer you to the memoirs of former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who details the orders he was given by Ben-Gurion to forcibly evict thousands of residents of the Arab town of Lida, now Lod, in central Israel, near where the airport is, and 10,000 or so Jewish residents of the territory that is now the West Bank and East Jerusalem were forced out of their homes by the Jordanian Legion. And as you just noted, in the wake of Israel's independence, about 700,000 Jews either fled or were forced out of their homes in North Africa and in the Arab world. So all of this defined the middle of the 20th century, the bloody horror of the 20th century. And once again, in the aftermath of all of that, that is why the responsible nations of the world set up these new systems, the Fourth Geneva Conventions, the United Nations, that said you can't do that anymore. So we can't justify the expulsion of anybody anymore based on what happened historically. The way the world reacted to the horrors of the 20th century was to say, yes, that is what used to happen. It can't happen anymore. And if we see, this is the reason why so many of us see Putin's invasion of Ukraine as a return of a level of evil in Europe that we had hoped and prayed was gone. But we always have to be vigilant, whether it's in the Balkans or in the 90s or in Ukraine now. And again, any talk by Israelis or Arabs of removing the other, physically removing the other, is not only dark fantasy, nightmarish stuff that is not realistic, but it's also the articulation of a violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. You can't do that anymore.
So where does Arab responsibility come in here? And by that, I mean the refusal to take Palestinians in, the refusal to take, the citizens of Gaza have no place to go now. I mean, they move from north to south. Egypt won't let them in. The Egypt street may be very sympathetic, but the leadership in Egypt certainly won't let them in. And I'm just talking about even places where they could get some sanctuary. The Arab countries don't want them.
Yeah, look, if we're historically over the last 75 or so years, the Arab countries bear as much responsibility as Israel for the state of affairs that exists today. And their relentless rejection of Israel, which has, of course, now changed in many areas, for many countries, their demonization of Israel, that is part of what caused the Arab street to, the fact that for decades, Arab leaders have blamed Israel for their own failings, for their own totalitarian instincts, for their own disastrous policies, domestic and foreign, they have blamed Israel for all of it. And that created generations of Arabs who see Israel as the ultimate bad guy, especially when you combine that with the understandable and legitimate concern that many Arabs have for the dispossessed Palestinians. Now, today, when we talk about what's happening in Gaza, you have this untenable situation in which Israel says, leave the north and go to the south, and then bombs areas in the south, and Egypt won't let people into the Sinai. On the one hand, one can understand how being perceived as being party to ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza is untenable and unacceptable for anybody. One would hope that something like what you just described, which is not something we hear very much about, by saying, look, this is a temporary haven for people who the international community guarantees will be able to return to their homes. One would hope something like that would happen, but there are understandable fears that would not, in fact, be what happened. Because again, this may anger some listeners, but the record isn't good. Palestinians who were forced out of, evicted from, or chased from, or who fled in terror their homes in 1948 were not allowed to go back to those homes. They were not allowed, any more than Jews who were forced out of Europe during the middle of the 20th century, or Arab and North African countries after the establishment of Israel were allowed to go back to their homes. So there's not a great record for lack of a better term, ethnic cleansings that are then reversed, right? I mean, you can drive the length and breadth of our beautiful country and to this day see reservations where Native Americans were corralled and forced, the remnants of the genocidal campaigns against Native Americans. It's not like anyone ever said, you know what, you can have Massachusetts back. So there's not a great record, and I certainly understand the fear of Palestinians who are told, no, you'll just go for a little while and then we'll let you come back. There is no historical record in their relationship with Israel and very little historical record in humanity's history to give anyone a sense that would happen.
Well, I'm often struck by the analogy, although the history goes much farther back, between Native Americans and Palestinians. In terms of land being taken, and you've written about this and talked about this, and then asking for land to be restored after essentially sovereignty has been established. And, you've got the state of Israel now. They've a law of return for Jews. And by the way, they're not all Ashkenazi Jews that settled in Israel. There's about 40%, is there not, Daniel, of citizens of Israel who are people who fled the Arab lands or who came from non-European countries, and many of them are of darker
It's much
skin.
higher than that now.
Is it? Yeah,
It's much higher than that. In terms of the Jewish population, it's well over 50%.
Well, here's a listener, Cynthia from Maine, who says, are Arab countries trying to avoid the troubles that occurred in Jordan after Palestinians were moved to Jordan?
That's
question.
A very good and sophisticated question.
Yes.
Yeah. And just to give listeners a sense of the context of the question, Jordan has a large an ethnic Palestinian population, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% or more of Jordanians. And during the early years of Israel's existence, up until the 1970s, the sort of center of a lot of the Palestinian resistance movement to Israel, the terrorist organizations, the militant organizations, the political organizations, were based in Jordan. And in fact, that culminated in in the 1970s into an event that is now known still as Black September, in which the forces of the King of Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan under King Hussein, declared war on what had essentially become a PLO-run state within a state within Jordan, and kicked them out in one of those fascinating little endnotes to history or footnotes to history. The Syrians were mobilized their tanks on behalf of the Palestinians against the Jordanians and started rumbling south towards Jordan to stop the Jordanian army. And the Israelis signaled that if Syrian tanks entered Jordan and started fighting, they would support the Jordanians. So one of those funny things that happened long before there was peace between Jordan and Israel. But the result of that was that so the Jordanian kingdom was destabilized, as the questioner asks, and then the leadership of the Palestinians went to Lebanon. They were exiled into Lebanon, where they destabilized Lebanon and contributed. They weren't the cause of, but they were one of the contributors to the chaos that engulfed Lebanon and has remained the characteristic of Lebanon, sort of an ungovernable collection of fighting groups. And then the PLO leadership in the 1980s, after Israel's invasion, was sort of exiled to Tunis. And from there, they returned to the West Bank as part of the Oslo Peace Accord. So when the questioner asks, when the listener asks, are other Arab countries concerned about that kind of destabilization? Perhaps that is part of what Egypt's concern is. Egypt never annexed the Gaza Strip, even though between the end of the Israeli War of Independence and the Six-Day War in 1967, so for 19 years, Egypt governed Gaza, and in fact declined Menachem Begin's offer to take Gaza back with the Sinai during the Camp David peace accords that established a lasting, albeit chilly, peace between Egypt and Israel. They said, no thanks, you keep it. So they may have been onto something, but I would say that now the Arab countries, what is very interesting is I think we are already seeing the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and some of the other Arab countries saying, look, in exchange for a Palestinian state, we will recognize Israel and help kind of repair and rebuild the situation in Gaza. And that is a cornerstone of the Biden administration's plan for what happens after the war. Again, a plan, as that you noted, has been rejected by Prime Minister Netanyahu.
There's a comment from Philip who says Native Americans were overtaken by foreign colonialists. The Jews in Israel were indigenous. Palestinians are cousins to Jews, sharing common descendants. The Palestinian anti-colonialist narrative is wholly inappropriate. And Reed wants to know who's going to undertake and pay for the rebuilding effort in Gaza. And you kind of indicated that the plan, at least for the Biden administration, is to move forward with Saudis and with whomever else might join in, presumably the UK, because they've been our ally for so long now and have actually gone into an alliance with us in the Red Sea against the Houthis. And there's all that to see into the equation as well. What do you see, though, about the hostages? I mean, at this point, I keep thinking, and it bears scrutiny, about one IDF soldier who was exchanged for thousands of Palestinian terrorists, in many instances, most of them terrorists, some of them now leading what happened and continuing to lead the aftermath of what happened October 7th. So where are we in terms of releasing these people who are being held, and probably one can't imagine what they're experiencing and undergoing. I mean, torture, presumably, as well as who knows what.
Well, as there are over 100 Israeli hostages still being held by Hamas. the majority of them citizens.
And excuse me, Daniel, there are Thai hostages. There are still Thai hostages. There are British hostages. I mean, American hostages. I mean, it's not only Israelis.
Yeah, there are still foreign nationals who are there. But most of the people who are still held hostage are civilians, Israeli civilians.
Yes.
In fact, the only release of hostages happened during a brief 10 or so day ceasefire, which is another argument that people who say we need an end to the hostilities make. The only time Israelis have been returned has been during that ceasefire. Look, the issue of the hostages is the central issue in Israel today. Put another way, in Israel, it is still October 7th, right? It is still a country that is deeply, deeply traumatized. And the nature of that trauma is that people are first and foremost concerned with the hostages who are held in Gaza, as well as Israeli soldiers who are dying in Gaza every day. And the disconnect between how events seem in Israel and how they seem outside of Israel, I think is really in many ways because of the ongoing nature of the hostage crisis in Israel. And that is also the source of extraordinary discontent and opposition to the Israeli government. Again, the Israeli government says our first goal is to eradicate Hamas and the threat, and then to rescue the hostages, and then, to ensure this never happens again. The Israeli public is, the vast majority of Israelis would say, the number one issue is returning those hostages. And one can understand, right, beyond the obvious natural inclination that any of us would have to see our beloved friends and family members and fellow country people returned to us from horrific captivity. The whole raison d'etre of Israel, as we've been talking about for the last hour or so, was to provide a place of safety and refuge for the Jewish people. If the government of Israel doesn't prioritize that safety, and now that is exemplified more than anything else by the hostages who are still held in Gaza, then the people of Israel will not support that government. And that is partly why we see that not more than 15 or 20% of Israelis say they support Benjamin Netanyahu and his government right now. This is the overriding issue for Israelis. And I think if you're a human being, your heart has to crack at this situation, right? In the aftermath of October 7th, I heard some people who I might have previously assumed or thought of as sort of political allies on the progressive side of American politics, where I sort of proudly stand. I was horrified to hear some of them argue that Hamas, because of the situation of Palestinians, because of the ongoing Israeli occupation of the West Bank, because of the plight of the Palestinian people, Hamas was justified in slaughtering 1,200 people, most of whom were civilians, women and children and elderly people, in their villages near Gaza, ironically, villages that tend to be very left-wing and liberal. This is an abomination.
It is
that
an abomination.
Position is an abomination.
When you include rape in that, and you include, those who have claimed themselves feminists and so forth, nevertheless,
right,
not criticizing that or saying it was time for Israel to face that kind of horror. But let me get back just for a second. We don't really have much time left here, but I'm just getting back to what you would say to those who say Hamas can't be eliminated. I mean, any more than ISIS was, although we hear the argument that ISIS was eliminated when that tribute came to Soleimani, who was killed by Americans, basically. ISIS was there. Israel and the United States are being blamed, of course, but ISIS is still, in fact, ISIS is Hamas. Hamas is ISIS.
Look, I think that it is one of the lessons that we have to derive from modern history or recent history, 20th, 21st century history, is that it is very difficult, if not impossible, to kill an idea. And there are ways to deal with it and to lessen the power of that idea. But I tend to think that right, the idea that gave rise, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which gave rise to this sort of militant strain of Sunni Islam, it was terrorists from that place in the world, in the ideological spectrum, who murdered President Sadat of Egypt. They are kindred to Hamas, Al Qaeda, ISIS. Now, as you said, these things are all still around. You can lessen their impact, but it's very impossible to eradicate it. And I think a lot of smart people have said that the goal as articulated by the Prime Minister of Israel is not a realistic one. You can mitigate the power of those ideas, but doing so requires the kind of enlightened, thoughtful leadership that we saw the United States and the Allies take at the end of World War II, where instead of razing Germany to the ground after they'd already won, they helped rebuild it. And they turned it into a prosperous society, and that dampened the appeal of the idea of Nazism. And the same can be true of militancy in Japan. We saw so I think that the goal, the sane goal has to be to try to weaken the idea that animates Hamas in the minds of so many Palestinians who have no horizon of hope and no horizon of any kind of different future. Providing that horizon, showing that the world, including Israel, including the Arab states, including responsible Palestinian leadership, is working together towards that horizon. That, to my mind, in addition to the necessary military response to terror acts and terror attacks, that's the only way you're going to eradicate the ideas that animate Hamas, is by showing that there's a different, better future. And we're not going to get there if the Prime Minister of Israel says absolutely not.
Well, with the more civilians who die, the more terrorists probably who are created. That's unfortunately one of the realistic paradoxes of all this. But I'm just wondering, can you really turn it around? I mean, the hatred is so intense. It starts off in teaching children, that these are inhumans that you have to kill. They've killed our people all these years. We have to kill them at any cost and so forth. And the brutality on both sides is immeasurable.
Yeah.
It's
Look,
abominable.
The obstacle, the biggest obstacle to turning it around, right, has never been a lack of political imagination. There are smart people who many times have come very close to moving their societies towards a different future. And in fact, it took their assassination in the case of Sadat or Rabin to really stop that movement. Or in the case of Hamas, the murder of scores and scores, hundreds of Israelis in order to extinguish support for a two-state solution. Or in the case of, the radical right-wing settler movement in the West Bank, the endless building of settlements that has extinguished hope for Palestinians. But those are products of a lack of political will, not a lack of political imagination. And here's the thing, maybe this is a fitting way to end, that gives me a little hope in, given what you've said. If you and I had been, if we had been walking around Europe in 1945, in the aftermath of the worst cataclysm in human history, the last act in 1,000 years of horrific war and brutality in Europe, if someone said to us, "Hey, listen, guys, by the time you are old men, this continent will be united in one economic union, right? Economic political union, flawed and problematic as it is, that you would not need to, not only do you not need to deal with a hostile foreign frontier to drive between France and Germany, the most implacable enemies, for much of Western civilizational history, but you don't even need to show a passport as you drive between them. And there's not even a border. We would have thought you were crazy. If someone had said to us in the 1980s, hey, guess what? You'll be able to drive from Dublin to Belfast without showing a passport, we would have said, that's fantasy. So my hope comes from the fact that things are only impossible until they're not. And with the right political will, we can see this turnaround. And so the question is, how do we get there?
A man who spent a year in Ireland, I know, so you're thinking about, struck by your optimism or just being sanguine. I often think about what happened in the breakup of the Soviet Union, although now, of course, we've got Putin, but also who would have believed it back then? Glasnost and Perestroika. Who would have believed South Africa would become, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, who was mostly in prison? So one doesn't know where these things are going to go.
Barack Obama would be elected president of the United States.
On those hopeful notes, I think we should conclude. And I want to thank you. Let me also thank all who joined us for this live episode of The Gray Matter with Michael Krasny podcast. And thanks to all who will be joining us on Apple, Spotify, or at graymatter.show. That's Gray with an E. And again, know that we appreciate your support. If you have not yet become a member, we urge you to do so simply by signing up at graymatter.show. My thanks to all, and of course that includes most definitely the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Colin, Chad, Jeff, and Colleen, and our special thanks to this episode special guest, Daniel Sokatch. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.